I think I'm going to need to call in some expert help for this one.
Today, I'm looking at the McLaren MP4, arguably the most successful Formula 1 car in history. Driven by both Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost, it won 15 of the 16 races it entered and achieved a 1-2 podium an incredible 10 times. Last year, I sat down with the chief designer, Steve Nichols, to talk about his career and the genesis of this car. But today, we've got something really special in store. You see, most Formula 1 cars you only get to see twice. Once on the telly, or if you're lucky in person, but at a great distance, then a few years later in a museum where really it could be a show car. Thanks to an incredibly kind owner of one of just 6 chassis in the entire world, and the team at Keep Close Spaces, today I can show you this car in a way that very few have seen it. We have 3 of the original 1988 McLaren team: Steve Nichols, the chief designer, Matthew Jeffries, project lead for monocoque and front suspension, and Neil Trundle, chief mechanic for the 88 and 89 season. These gentlemen have come here not just to share their memories of the creation and campaign of this car, but also to help me take it apart and talk you through what was in 1988 one of the most advanced and closely guarded cars in the world. A particular thank you must also be given to Matthew, who was instrumental in not just the creation of this car, but also this video. If you are a fan of classic Formula 1 and on the hunt for a gift for yourself or others, I can highly recommend one of his limited edition artworks. Created in exacting detail, these are accurate scale representations of some of history's most successful racers. As a special thank you from us to viewers of the channel, he is offering a discount across most of the range, including some very limited edition prints signed by some of the team members and even drivers of the cars depicted.
Just to whet your appetite further, there are 30 examples of this beautiful print of chassis number 5, and they have been signed by the 3 gentlemen behind and beside me.
Wow, this is a bit special. This is the 88 15 out of 16 winning car, and it's very special to be here and see it and be a part of this production. This was the car that Senna drove in Brazil, and it was a fraught time to get it there. In fact, this chassis arrived, this was the spare car, arrived in pieces. We'd worked day and night to get there. It was all a bit late, but that was nothing unusual. I think we were confident because the car was quick in testing, but only we knew just how quick it was, I think. So we arrived in Brazil, mechanics started to assemble the spare car. 2 cars were more or less complete, the Senna and the Prost car. This is chassis 3, which was in pieces. A lot of work, day and night, late nights to arrive at qualifying, but we were confident and we were up for it. You've got to remember that at the same time as us having the Honda engine, and this was our first year with the Honda engine, Lotus also had the same engine. Williams had a similar engine the year before, but we had Senna and Prost, probably the 2 best drivers in the world at the time, and we were going to do it. So we came to first practice. By then we had 3 cars. In those days you had 2 race cars, and you had a T car sitting there ready to go. The rules were, during that season, between the 2 drivers, that they randomly selected, so it was 16 races, they randomly selected which race they had priority use of the T car. I mean, it was available for the other driver, but they had prior call on it during practice. And often they would choose the spare car as their race car. Yeah, this was Prost car, chassis 3. So they were running around in practice. Suddenly Prost came in the pits and the whole nose assembly was dragging on the ground, which was a bit of a shock. So we took the nose off, and the nose box was also hanging on the ground. And what had happened was that the whole front bulkhead, well, the top part of the bulkhead, had become delaminated, not from design. There was an error back at the workshop. In the panic, there was an error in fitting the nose box, and the bulkhead had been, or the front of the car had been filed away to fit the nose, and it took away the outer layer of carbon, and the whole top of the front bulkhead peeled off and the nose was on the ground. That was a bit of an alarm call. We looked at the other cars, they weren't as bad. Prost took over another chassis. We did a repair on this. We did a resin repair and we put some reinforcing rods on this car. I think we might have put it on the other cars as well, just as to be doubly sure. Come the race, they went round on the parade lap, came to the grid and switched off the engines. We went out to the cars, did a few little adjustments and then started them up for the lap to the grid. There was the countdown, Senna was sitting there, and as he put it in gear, suddenly he was waving his arms, and what had happened was that the gear shifter had lightning hole up the inside, quite a big hole, and it had been drilled too far, and at that point, it parted company, and he had no gear change. So he was waving his arms. Ron Dennis and Barry Oldham ran out, climbed over the barrier, and tried to fix the car. Meanwhile, all the engines are running. The starter is waiting to start the race. And then the marshal said, leave it, you've got to get off. So Ron and Barry jumped back over. The car was wheeled away. Meanwhile, Ayrton ran to the pits to get in the spare car. The cars went off and Senna left at about 30 seconds after the start. Within a few laps, of course, he was up with the back markers and he was climbing through the field, but they decided that he had started after the race had officially started, so they black flagged him, which was a shame. Yeah, that was a bit of a drama. Prost won the race quite easily, and that was one Brazilian home Grand Prix that Senna missed. He missed quite a few. I think it wasn't until '91 that he got his home Grand Prix win. He was devastated, so were the crowd. The car performed well, the engine was fantastic, and yeah, first of many.
Okay, well this is the MP4 from 1988, and if I could just tell you a little bit about the external features and some of the differences between it and its predecessor, the MP4 You can see that the nose is a similar shape, but just much narrower. The monocoque, even from the beginning, you can see is a squarer shape, bigger sectional area, so it's stiffer. We had a rule then that the driver's feet had to be behind the front axle. It made the packaging of the front somewhat difficult. You've got to fit in the dampers and the driver's feet, and so the chassis tapers out and becomes bigger as it goes back. So we mounted the dampers vertically in this area, and the pull rod is angled back. So we had more room for the driver's feet here, and then slightly further back the dampers.
So the front wing on the 4.4 was a slight deviation from the previous year because the main plane was actually a one-piece structure, went through the nose box, located it on jaws, which take the main plane aero load and drag such that the resultant vector went through the corner of the jaw, which gave it very good location and stability. And the nose box is carbon fibre, which was the first carbon fibre nose box McLaren did. And we did that with the aid of a 10-metre drop tower, which we built out at the back of the factory. Rather than an aluminium structure, the carbon structure was designed so that the energy was absorbed by effectively turning it to dust. And the end plates of this particular shape, because the aerodynamicists found that it was a more effective shape than a lower cut version. So that's why they are as they are here. On the bottom edge of the end plates, there's what looks like a wooden strip, and it is, in fact, a laminated wooden strip called Jabrock, with a Kevlar hinge, in effect, between the wooden strip and the carbon fibre main structural part of the end plate. That was designed so that if it hit the curbs, it had a degree of flexibility. In those days, you're not allowed to have movable aerodynamic devices, of course, but this was deemed such that it was just a stiffness issue, and it was allowed.
The side pods were quite low. They're pretty much identical to the side pods that we had on the MP4 The whole engine cover area is a bit lower than the 4.3. The Honda engine was more compact, and the fuel tank had gone down to 150 liters, so the fuel tank was smaller, the engine was smaller, and so the center part of the car is lower than the 4.3. We wanted to fit the driver into the same profile as the fuel tank and the engine, so the driver was reclined a little bit more than on the 4.3 to get his shoulders down in the same profile as the engine and the fuel tank. The so-called Coca-Cola shape was the same as on the 4.3. There's it's quite an abrupt shape there, and that was because there's a turbocharger in there, so we needed to have the bodywork go around the turbocharger. We could get away with quite a sharp radius there because the tire forces the air to go inboard of the tire and then up the top surface of the diffuser, and diverting that air through there tends to fill the hole in the air behind the car. The rear suspension, quite similar to the 4.3, it's got a push rod compared to the pull rod on the front. You can see a little duct there for the gearbox oil cooler. Rear wing is mounted to the gearbox with these twin carbon plates to support it. The end plate's quite big, quite rectangular. We needed a degree of flexibility between the diffuser and the end plates, but we didn't want them flapping around. So there's a tongue at the bottom of the end plate which fits into a little slot on the diffuser, which keeps the end plate from flapping around too much, but introduces a degree of flexibility between the end plate and the floor. And then the exhaust comes out either side into the diffuser area. So that's about it from what you can see externally.
So tyres, all the teams were running Goodyear tyres, but it's interesting to note that in this period, qualifying was qualifying tyres. When we talk about qualifying tyres, we mean tyres that are super sticky, a slow warm-up and then one fast lap, to the point where when they come in the garage, they are like glue. We were talking earlier that until we got the trick of unsticking them from the floor when the cars had come in, until that point, often they come in from qualifying, stop in the garage, and generally the mechanics immediately lift the front of the car up. Well, we've got pull rod suspension. So if the tyres are stuck to the garage floor, when you lift the car, the pull rod was put into compression and the thing would bend like a banana and it would scrap the pull rod. So we'd have to change them. We soon twigged that, so we'd either put water on the floor or we'd roll the car backwards and forwards to unstick them before we jack them up. All teams had qualifying tyres. We had different compounds of tyres, not like modern Formula One where the tyre choice is restricted. You could run a mix of compounds if you wanted around the car for the race. So we had this pull rod suspension, which was rising rate, which Steve introduced on this car. It was a great system, worked very well. The brakes. These are carbon brakes, and the carbon brakes have been around for a few years. But these calipers, we'd had them at McLaren's over a few years with our cars. They were designed and manufactured by McLaren. For a few years we did our own design until we got an outside brake company to supply a caliper. Because of low engine deceleration, because it's a small turbo engine, I think Steve and the designers decided that we needed 2 calipers on each corner. So we had 8 calipers. The brake ducts, they look very simple now, but they worked fine, and you could control the cooling of the ducts just simply by taping. You had to get it right for the race, but we would adjust it by altering how much air went in. There wasn't a limit on the number of tyres, unlike now, so every session was a new set of tyres from Goodyear. And of course, in the race, you had the choice of how many. You could stop 4 times if you wanted in the race. But and Goodyear did a good job on the tyres. practice and qualifying, same set of brakes, and then a fresh set of pads for the race, same calipers, suspension, you know, that did the whole weekend. Steel track rods, very lightweight. I think they could take a bit more impact than carbon ones now. That's my personal view. So it's worth looking at the wheel nuts on this period of cars. So compare with modern Formula One cars and pit stops. I mean, we changed tyres during the race. They'd seldom go the whole race. So it was very simple. It's a hexagonal nut. The wheel is located with pegs, but it's a simple hexagonal nut. So the mechanic has actually got to find the hex. It's also, by regulation, has to have a safety peg in case the wheel comes loose to stop the wheel nut coming off. So this is a process that the mechanic's very involved in. Nowadays, as the car comes in, they literally on and off, and the nut is retained in the wheel that's going on. So here, the mechanic has actually got to undo the tab, gun it off, gun the nut on, and put the peg back in. So inevitably, it's going to take longer, but actually, we could achieve pit stops in, it's not the 2.2 seconds they do now. I think our fastest was in Spain. I think we did a 4 or 5 second stop. I mean, the guys were good and fast, but it's a longer process. Same process as now, really. 3 on each wheel. A gun guy, one taking the wheel off, one putting the wheel on, a front jack man and a rear jack man, and also what we call the lollipop man. So this was generally Ron Dennis, who stood at the front with a lollipop, and when he saw that all the wheels were on, he released the car. Probably a bit more reliable than nowadays, goes wrong. So very simple, but it worked. I have to say that the whole car was easy to maintain. The design made them very user-friendly. Subsequent races, we generally had 4 cars. So we had 2 race cars, the regular T car on the ground, ready to go, and often we had a spare chassis in a box, part assembled with all its wiring looms, no suspension for emergency. 3 cars on the ground, 3 mechanics on each car. So you had number 1 on each car and 2 number 2s. And they stayed with those cars. We had the most fantastic crew in '88. 100% dedicated, could go without sleep for 2 days if necessary, but they were brilliant mechanics. In the evenings, we'd all go out together. So 3 on each car. Me as chief mechanic. We had a guy that looked after the tyre logistics, a fuel guy, travelling fabricator to do any repairs. That was about it. We were a small team.
When you think about how it all comes to be, the design process, you know, first of all, you've got to consider the rules and the components that you have to work with, what engine you're going to have, people that you have to work with, trying to apply all the brain power to the task. So it starts off just a thought process. What do we want to do? How can we build the best possible car? And from there, you have some ideas, and then maybe you do a few sketches. Matthew is very good at doing sort of 3D sketches of how things could possibly be. Then you go into more detail with layouts, you know, laying out the whole concept of the car on the drawing board, and then you can carry on from that to start doing all the detailed design. I often wonder if that wasn't a mistake. Should we have proceeded further down the design path with the TAG turbo Porsche engine? But in the end, I suppose it was right to wait, and so that we could have a better, complete, integrated design with the chassis and the engine. I think if we'd have got further down the Porsche TAG turbo route, then we would have been sort of adapting to the Honda engine, and it wouldn't perhaps be as idealized. It did make it late. And I was well aware that it put everybody else, we're the beginning of the process, and it put everybody else late to build the car, to test the car, to get it to Brazil. I suppose the whole thing was 8 months from the very beginning of the thought processes to being on the track in Imola.
So Steve, there were 17 of us under you as the chief designer. I was assigned responsibilities for the sort of forward part of the monocoque, the nose box, and the front suspension, in terms of the layout and the detail design. But then we had some really great people. We had David North, of course, doing the gearbox, David Nielsen on the rear suspension, Hugh Moran, often overlooked, but a great Kiwi engineer who, with a little Hewlett-Packard calculator, managed to work out all the angles and hard points of the drop-in piece for the cockpit, which we'll talk about at some point.
That was incredibly difficult to make that all fit the two pieces together. So Huey did a great job there.
Here we are, guys, at the back of the car. We've got to look at some detail here. Let's talk about the rear wing and adjustability of downforce, fast to slow circuits.
Well, the circuits through the year are very different. You know, a place like Monaco, Hungary, you'd want maximum downforce, biggest wing, that sort of thing. And places like Monza, then you'd want to minimize that. So we had 2 or 3 different sizes of rear wing. And then the flap here is adjustable. You can see on this one there's 3 positions, so you can increase the angle of attack of the flap to adjust the downforce there. And also you see there's holes in the flap here where we could bolt on different sizes of the so-called gurney flap to further increase the adjustment range of the rear wing. So yeah, it was a matter of optimizing the amount of downforce there to suit the particular circuit that we were at the time.
And the other thing I remember, such was the aero load pushing in the M fences because of the low pressure, these things would bend under, and then you came up with this design. And I remember we had it bolted permanently, but it would break this off.
Yeah, sure.
So then we made this little adjustable slider, which was...
So it keeps the wing from flapping around, the
stops
end
them
plate
bending
doing
in,
this.
yeah.
The funny thing about that, though, Neil,
flexibility there for
the funny thing about that, it was not carried over on the following year's car, on the 5.
That's true.
And I'm never quite sure why Neil didn't.
Maybe the M fences were stiffer.
Well, I think they were largely the same, but I have to go back.
And you've even got a wicker bill going flat on here to increase the difference of pressure.
Well, it helps a little bit with the stiffness of the end plate, but also it gives you a little more
difference of
suction, so to speak, to pull the air around the corner.
So we had 3, I think, an R1, R2 and R3 that were called,
Yeah.
This was the R3, I think, the lowest downforce option. But to change it, you unbolt it and change the whole unit.
Yeah, change the whole, and it was easy to use. And we had, for simplicity and recognition, remember we had a colour coding, paint colour coding, orange, yellow and blue of the different options, so that we always knew we got the right combination. I'll tell you a funny story about the back end of this. The regulation after the race, scrutineering, and any time during scrutineering, one of the requirements was you had to be able to engage reverse. Well, we used to get so much wind up on the gear shift that it wouldn't quite take it far enough at the back, and so the scrutineer would be at the front with Gary, and he'd be showing them to engage, and one of us at the back would sneak a spanner on and just give it the tweaks.
Well, because you can imagine that you
the wind up on the
there's a gear shift there, and there's that linkage in between, which is all fairly small tubes, and you just get that torsional wind up.
That was at Ricard with Prost and Senna. They were dicing, and with 10 laps to go, I didn't know who was going to win, and the nut came undone, the lock nut, and Senna lost the sideways movement. And thereafter we put a lock tab on it.
To make sure that it couldn't
So the last thing you did before the race was make sure he was happy with it and bang the lock tab over.
So the front wing was also had a range of adjustment so that we could have low downforce at places like Monza and high downforce at Monaco or Hungary. So you can see there's holes across the flap here, so we could put the gurney flaps on there or take them off for more and less downforce. And then you see here there's a number of holes there to adjust the angle of attack of the flap, and they're in very fine increments really, so that you had to have 3 rows of holes, because if you tried to do them all in one row they would run into each other and you just have a slot. Now I remember one time Ayrton had he had some high-speed understeer, and he wanted an adjustment. So I said, well, we'll add one more hole of flap. And he said, no, it's too much. And I said, well, we'll just raise one flap on one side, not do the other side. And he said, no, that's still too much. So I said, okay, we'll move it up one hole, but I'll get the mechanics to slot that hole so that we can move it down a little bit more, and effectively it'll be a half a hole on one side. And he said, yeah, okay, that'll be good. He was that sensitive, you know, that he could feel these tiny little aero adjustments. And even on things like tire pressure, I'd arrive on the grid. He used to like to do 3 laps through the pits before the start of the race to get some temperature into the tire, and he'd arrive on the grid and he'd want me to adjust the tire pressure by 1/4 of a PSI, you know, which probably made no difference, but it made him feel happy and gave him a bit more confidence. So extremely sensitive to the adjustments on the car. Just from an aesthetic point of view, I was keen to maintain a family resemblance, so to speak, and make it look like a McLaren. So it's still kind of a chisel-shaped nose.
I'm sure it made no difference to you, but I can remember you really agonising over the exact radius that you wanted on the tip of the nose.
I know.
It's daft. It sounds daft now, but
I know it was a nightmare, but I did kind of want it like I wanted it. So then, just carrying on a little bit, you know, we had the little windscreen here, and you can see that it's like 2 shapes. There's a shape here, and then there's this additional shape there. And we wanted to carry that line through. You know, a lot of times you get a car and there's a shape here and a shape there, and it's kind of like connect the dots. And I wanted it to sort of flow from one end to the other. So that same shape carries right through. So you've got those 2 shapes again here, and then they blend out there, kind of like a teardrop shape behind the driver's head. So I had to rely on Matthew with his artistic skills to do these little sketches and come up with the shape, and then our manufacturing people were able to turn that into the beautiful shape.
And Colin Smith, of course, who did all the bodywork sections. I mean, he was sort of tearing his hair out a bit in terms of, because you've obviously got hard points to miss underneath, but to get exactly what you wanted.
But I think the way we did that is Colin did all those sections every 100 millimeters, or when there was a little more detail, maybe every 50 millimeters. And then wasn't it Emlyn Hughes that had to...
Down on the buck.
Yeah, so he had to do this wooden shape. He had that special sort of soft, fine-grained wood, and it was quite impressive, I thought, because you could go there and you could just run your hand over the shape of that wooden buck, and it's amazing what you can feel. You know, and it'd be just a little wobble, and he'd smooth that out, and you could make it just perfect with those hand techniques, so to speak. Later on, I know when we got into surfacing, and our CAD jockeys would do all these surfaces, and there'd be various surfaces that they have to knit them together, and you'd look at it on the screen and you'd think, yeah, that's good. And then they'd machine it, so it's done on CAD, machined on CAM, and you've got this huge lump of tooling block. And you'd run your hand over it, and you'd think, there's a little wiggle there. And it would be where they'd knitted 2 surfaces together, and it just wasn't quite perfect in the digital world. And then we'd have to, you know, sort of apply that little bit of hand fettling to make it just perfect.
So I remember, Steve, you had a good idea of, once you knew the engine, obviously we knew the fuel capacity, you wanted to change the monocoque to go away from the V shape that we used to have to a more flat-sided shape, so the fuel centered, gravity came down a bit. And then our job was to take your ideas and scheme them out. So I can remember my wonder scheme that I called it, you know, of this section of the car. And from that, we detailed on the drawing board, not on CAD in 87, 88, but we detailed the various concepts as schemes just to make sure everything was going to fit in.
I wanted to do things a little bit differently in that era of the MP4-3 and the MP4-4. We'd been pretty tightly controlled by John Barnard in the previous years, and now it was our chance to do something of our own. And I was aware that I didn't want to restrict everybody to exactly my ideas. I wanted everybody to contribute. I used to be quite self-critical, but I would also encourage everybody to criticize my ideas. When we'd get to the position where nobody could come up with some reasons why it wouldn't work, then it gave me confidence that it would work. My job, more than anything, was to try to integrate all of the ideas into a whole to get the right compromise of everything, so to speak.
There were 17 of us, but we all really got on well together. We were a proper team.
It was really quite good. At the time we were just a bunch of nobodies, and we all liked each other, respected each other, worked well together, and this, to me, was the ultimate expression of teamwork, and everybody could feel invested in the car. Just to give you a little background about how these cars are made, if I can go right back to the very early 80s when we did the very first carbon fiber monocoque. We'd done a deal with Hercules in America. I had worked at Hercules straight out of university, and we went to them to get the carbon components made. It was very leading edge and very visionary of John Barnard to take the risk and attempt to make a whole monocoque out of carbon fiber. So the initial parts of the monocoque, the main shell and the bulkheads that went inside that shell to make it a complete monocoque, were laminated by Hercules in Salt Lake City. And then they would send those parts to us, and we would bond them all together to form the completed monocoque. Later, the next stage of our development in the manufacturing of these monocoques, Hercules would supply us with all the carbon fiber materials, the pre-preg unidirectional carbon, things like that, the resins and the fibers, and then we would laminate those components ourselves. In the beginning, we didn't have an autoclave, so that we would assemble the whole thing on the mold, and it would be all vac bagged and prepared to go into an autoclave, and then we would load that into a trailer with a vacuum pump to keep the vacuum on the monocoque while it was transported down to the south coast, and we used somebody else's autoclave to cook the thing. Then later, quite soon after that, in fact, we managed to buy and install our own autoclave, and then we could do all those processes ourselves. But Hercules were still a sponsor and still provided us with all the raw materials to do the lamination. More and more the car became carbon fiber. This one, monocoque's carbon, the bodywork's all carbon, the wings are all carbon, and of course, later on, even all the suspension was carbon and gearbox case was carbon. So it was the beginning of a process starting in 1981. And now the cars you see, they're almost all carbon, it seems like. One interesting detail that changed over the course of the season, initially the car had a snorkel in this area for the air inlet for the turbo. So there's a turbo either side. And Huey Moran had done this fairly complex shape to have a sort of trapezoidal shaped air inlet here that would then morph into a round shape where it went into the turbo. For the Silverstone Grand Prix in July, we changed to a system where we eliminated that snorkel, and the air would enter through the radiator inlet duct here. Just a bit simpler. The car looks better without those snorkels, and it reduces the drag by a minuscule amount, I suppose. But it was, one of the nice detailed changes that happened through the course of the year. The cars are obviously the Marlboro red and white. It's called Rocket Red, and it's kind of a day-glow red. It's quite a special paint. And to have it come out that color, you first have to paint the whole car white, and then the red has to go on over the white undercoat, so to speak, to come out the right color. So it's completely white, and then the red on top of that, so that's extra paint. And then you have to have a ultraviolet resistant clear coat that goes on top of that, so that's another coat of paint that goes on. So the entire paint job is probably 7 kilos, which I'm always probably overly insistent on the car being lightweight, so 7 kilos of paint is really quite irritating.
I guess Ron overruled you.
Well, obviously. Ron wanted the cars perfect every race. So George had to paint the car in between every race. I wanted the cars as light as possible, so I didn't want multiple layers of paint. So I'm insisting that George strip the car back to bare carbon between every race because Ron wants it repainted between every race. And of course what George used to say to me is, look, you can't rush the chemicals. It takes a certain amount of time to dry. And of course, you know, the cars come back from a race, maybe they get back on Tuesday and they got to leave about 8 days later or something. He's got to strip and repaint. Yeah. So I remember once I was down with George in the paint shop, and you have to put the paint stripper on. You can't leave it very long or it attacks the resin in the carbon. And then he uses his scraper to scrape it off. And he's scraping the thing off like this, and I can see, you know, you look at it, it looks like a barber puller set. You could see red, white, red, white, red, white, where he's painted it 3 or 4 times. And I'm saying, oh, George, you're stripping it back to bare carbon every time. What's all this red, white, red, white, red, white? So yeah, that was a constant battle. I didn't get away with this one either, but I told George, look, put the stickers on the bare carbon, paint it, then peel the stickers off, and we'll have bare carbon where the Marlboro is. I thought, yeah, that's great, saves a little bit of weight. But Ron came along and the carbon wasn't shiny enough, so we had to go back to this, and there's another ½ an ounce on the car.
Yeah, looking at this actually, I remember after Brazil, where the roll hoops were left bare, titanium, and in fact they were coated with a Teflon spray material, which I think George sourced. Anyway, to make any rubber or any debris that went on them slide off easily. But I remember going down to the factory after Brazil, and then coming in one morning, and all of a sudden all the cars had white roll hoops. And I said, George, what's happened? He said, Ron.
Ron happened.
Because the boss was down here in Brazil, and either boss or Ron wasn't happy with it, so he could sell more expensive space.
And he needed the contrast between the black boss and the white roll hoop. Yeah. I must admit it does look better white.
I think so, yeah.
But it's the highest point on the car, so it's the most important weight you can have.
And then the emergency pull handle, I remember the night of the first car build, just before it went to Imola, the all-nighter that we did, somebody said, where's the pull handle? And nobody had
Didn't
remembered.
exist.
So I can remember about 4 o'clock in the morning drawing something up, and then Austin going and making it, and George spraying it, and it was made in about 3 hours flat. But yeah.
So now that we have the bodywork off, you can sort of see the air management of the car. All of the air enters here, and you can see there's the radiator here for the air to pass through. And then there's a small space here where part of the air then is ducted around and into the intercooler here. And then in between those two, around the inboard end of the radiator and then around the outboard end of the intercooler, the air for the turbo comes around that sort of S-bend and then into the turbocharger, as you can see there. So that's really the whole air management system on the car. The exhaust was all made out of Inconel, as I recall, a high grade of steel that's very temperature resistant. And as you can see there's the the main exhaust out of the turbo, and then another secondary exhaust out of the wastegate there, and then they both exit through the diffuser. You know, we were restricted, and so we had to run this pop-off valve here, given to us by the FIA. There have been stories in the past about people that felt that maybe Honda were maybe not exactly cheating, but exploiting the rules by trying to place the pop-off valve in an area where the pressure wasn't necessarily the same as in the rest of the inlet manifold there, and therefore we could run a little higher horsepower. It's a bit of a spurious argument because we were limited to 150 litres of fuel, so even if we could find a way to cheat the pop-off valve, we would have run out of fuel before the end of the race. So it's very much a function of trying to manage how much horsepower you could run throughout the duration of the race. We ran in the race just over 600 horsepower, maybe as much as 650 in qualifying. It was adjustable horsepower though, and you have to remember that you know, this was a period of time where they were running normally aspirated cars and the turbo cars at the same time. The normally aspirated cars were the future, and the FIA wanted them to win, and so they had a weight advantage. They could run, I can't remember, I think 20 kilos lighter than we could. We were restricted boost pressure and 150 litres of fuel. So the rules were all stacked against us, really, and particularly in the early stage of the race, we'd have to turn the boost up a little bit to stay ahead of the normally aspirated cars, and then gradually as they would die away, well, the drivers could turn down the boost and with their controls on the dash, and then reduce the boost, reduce the revs, lift and coast. And the other thing the drivers had to do, because people talk about it being an economy run, but what it really meant is they were limited on horsepower, and they had to take all their speed out of the car itself, not just turn the boost up and run extra horsepower. They had to take it out of the car, and they had to take it out of themselves. So they had to be right on the limit every corner, every lap, to try to maximize the performance and finish the race on the fuel. So particularly towards the end of the race, we might be 2 laps down on the fuel. And they'd have to recover maybe over the last 10 or 15 laps. They'd have to try to recover that 2 laps of fuel in order to finish the race. So, well, we were very fortunate to have this Honda engine. It was a highly developed engine that had been running for years. It had been running with Spirit and with Williams and with Lotus. So when we received it, it was just a beautiful engine package. Generated quite adequate horsepower, and it got very good fuel economy in order to finish the race on 150 litres of fuel. Compared to our previous Tag turbo designed and built by Porsche, it was more compact, it was lower, so we were able to make the whole installation, the whole car, a bit lower and more compact. The Porsche engine was run effectively like 2 3-cylinder engines, and so it had 2 of these pop-off valves, 2 of these logs, one for each 3-cylinder bank, with 2 of these pop-off valves back here. So the back end of the 4.3 was more bulbous in that area because of the taller engine and the two pop-off valves. I remember early on in our relationship with Honda, they used to send young engineers rotate through the factory for experience, and one of the young engineers messaged me back from Japan saying how he'd appreciated his experience in the UK, and now he was working far into the night to improve reliability. And at that stage, we'd had 1 engine failure in testing, you know, and they were still giving it all to improve the engine reliability. Honda were fantastic in that regard. You know, they would hit it with all the resources. You know, you'd have a debrief and there'd be these problems, and they had so much staff, so much resource that they'd probably assign 3 or 4 engineers to each problem. And, whereas we were much smaller, and it was the opposite with us. Each engineer would be assigned 3 or 4 problems. So, but it was a great experience working with Honda, and even though they were pretty much the other side of the world, we worked so well. The engine, as I say, was quite low, and this was enabled for the most part because Tilton had come up with this multi-plate carbon clutch, so a smaller diameter, which meant you could lower the whole engine. And in fact, it was so low that the gearbox was too low and the drive shaft angles weren't practical. So we had to design a new gearbox that had a third shaft, an extra pair of gears to raise the output level up to something that was suitable for the drive shafts. And for that job, we commissioned Pete Wiseman to do the concept of the gearbox. And he worked with our engineers to come up with that concept. And then our gearbox designer, Dave North, brilliant engineer, and he did all the detailed design on that gearbox. And it performed flawlessly, really. And of course, he carried on to do the next year's car with a transverse gearbox, also done in conjunction with Pete Wiseman. But that allowed us to have the engine as low as possible. Lotus, using the same engine, had opted not to do that, and they tilted the engine to raise the back end of the engine up, but that sort of cut in half the advantage of having the low center of gravity of the engine, because it was partially raised up in the air at the back. So it's just another little example of us doing a thoroughly integrated design between the engine and the chassis. If we look at our circuit simulation program, we know that if you can reduce the weight of the car by 10 kilograms, it's worth, on average, 0.3 of a second. Hence the extensive use of carbon fiber.
And were we down to the weight limit?
Yeah.
Without any ballast?
Yeah. Okay. So the weight was very important. The other thing that was very important to me was center of gravity. The weight of the car, as you go around the corner, the force acts through the center of gravity, which is obviously some way off the ground, and that tends to make the car want to roll. And once again, from our computerized circuit simulation program, we know that if you can lower the center of gravity by just 10 millimeters, that's worth on average about 0.3 of a second per lap. So I was always dead keen on as light as possible and center of gravity, everything on the car as low as we could possibly make it. So this car ended up being quite low, and I think, as we've mentioned before, the Honda engine was lower and more compact, and that meant that we could once again lower the center of gravity. We did other things, for example, other materials. Over the years, as we've mentioned before, we machined our own calipers from billets of aluminium to improve the braking characteristics, to make the calipers stiffer so the brake pedal was firmer. In the beginning, it was just aluminium alloy, but later on, I knew that there was this very stiff, very light material called aluminium beryllium. So I wanted aluminium beryllium calipers. So we went. Our caliper supplier was AP, and I went to AP and said to them I wanted aluminium beryllium calipers, and they initially said no, they didn't want to make them, and I said, well, we can do one of three things. You can make them for us, or you can license us to make them with your drawings, or we'll just design our own. But one way or the other, we're going to have aluminium beryllium calipers. And so eventually they relented and made these calipers for us. Aluminium beryllium is not all that plentiful, supplied by Brush Wellman in America. And Ron Dennis bought every bit of aluminium beryllium in the world that's big enough to make calipers. so nobody else could have them because there was no material available. So I'd been to Bob Illman, our financial director, and said, I want this lightweight aluminium beryllium for the calipers. And within a few days, we're trying to make the car as light as possible so that we can carry more ballast and we can put the ballast down low. And at one stage, this was later than this car, but at one stage we'd got the car to where it was 70 kilos under the weight limit. So we were carrying 70 kilos of ballast. Lead was just way too light and took up too much space. So, I was asking our financial director for all this expensive lightweight aluminium beryllium and also this very heavy tungsten. And he didn't quite understand, but of course you need the right material in the right place. Lightweight, stiff calipers, but compact, lightweight tungsten ballast.
One interesting story which caused us a little bit of grief, to say the least, just probably a week before the car was due to run at Imola, Ray Rowe, also known as Tex, who had been one of Bruce's originals back in the early 60s and was still with us and still is with McLaren from time to time, walked into the drawing office, as he sometimes did, with the rack and pinion assembly in his hands, and he was just twiddling the pinion and the rack, watching the rack going in and out. And I was in Steve's office with Steve, and Tex sidles up to us and says, I've been playing with this for half an hour now, and I'm pretty sure that when the driver turns right, the car's going to go left. Now, when it's only 7 days before the car's supposed to run, if that was true, and Tex being who he was and being around forever generally doesn't make that kind of mistake, we were basically pretty alarmed and panicked. So it transpired, of course, that this car, as opposed to many of the previous McLarens, has the steering rack and pinion on the front bulkhead, so that the track rods and steering arms are ahead of the front axle, which means that the pinion is on the opposite side of the rack to Tex, as he would probably previously remember it. So once we'd explained to him that that was the case, everybody was relieved that we didn't have a major disaster on our hands.
Well, let's talk about the first race, Brazil. And we said earlier that this car was in pieces when it arrived. We had all the suspension with us, and so we started assembling it. But it's worth noting that this is the car we talked about where the bulkhead fell out, and this is our trackside repair in the field. We did a carbon composite repair with Steve obviously overseeing it and approving it, but done by us mechanics. Not very pretty, but it worked. And so the process arriving at the track, this car wouldn't have had the engine in. In fact, often the engines would arrive at the circuit and we'd fit the engines at the circuit. The suspension was on, the setup was done at the factory, although we used to alter the setup at the track. There's an interesting little detail on this car, which I said to Matthew, what are these little weeny blocks down here for? So this is a little ride height datum. And
So that's what you'd use to measure the ride height.
so we had the setup wheels on the bar across the top, and with a vernier, you'd measure down to that datum, and that datum was set at the factory on the surface table to the suspension point. So all the cars, that was in exactly the right position. Fairly easy to put together. I mean, you know what they say, it's only nuts and bolts. And the mechanics are very dexterous, so just a question of assembling everything. These cars, in this period, everything, so the datums are machined, the wishbones are machined. Like these wishbones, you know, you haven't got to bend them in position, they are machined to dimensions. Everything is drawn and machined, which earlier cars, you know, one wishbone wouldn't fit another car. So everything fits nicely. So 3 guys on each car, number 1 mechanic and 2 number 2 mechanics. Number 2 mechanic, one of them would be a front end man, one of them would be a rear end man. The number 1 guy would oversee, but the number 1 guy would generally do all the in-tank fuel system. You know, the hatch would come off, the fuel bags, all the pumps, he would do that part. A gearbox guy travelled with us as well, so we wouldn't change the ratios. If there was a ratio change, the mechanics would strip the back end off and put it in a tray, and then the gearbox guy would come along. Obviously the engineers had selected the ratios, and he would assemble them all in the back cover, and then we would put it back on and bolt it up. The engine was Honda's total responsibility. And we had probably 15 Honda guys at the track. So we had Gotto, a top man, genius. He was the manager, director of the Honda operation. Generally, we had a Honda mechanic allocated to each car, and then we had the guys doing the data and adjustments. Process of starting the car. So, right, you've got to put the fuel in. So qualifying, you had a different fuel in qualifying to racing. So we talked about the limitation of fuel capacity, 150 litres in 88, and the turbo limit. This was to try and get equivalency with the 3.5 litre cars, but what wasn't mentioned was the rocket fuel that the turbo cars ran. There was no restriction on fuel. So we qualified with 80% toluene I don't know if you remember that. Yeah. And we raced with about 60% toluene. Toluene is oxygen generating fuel and it's rocket fuel. So with only 150 litres, we could run generally full performance throughout the race without any fuel limitation. Very dense fuel as well. Our mechanic would operate the starter. The cars are started, they don't have an onboard starter. And equally, if you spun one of these cars, you could stall it. Nowadays you've got anti-stall on Formula One cars. So no onboard starter. So the starter, electric starter, is plugged in the rear and it engages with the lay shaft. So our guys on the starter, the Honda guys on the throttle, and on any adjustments to the engine management. And check the oil level, which is in here. Fire it up, run it for 20 seconds, stop the engine, check the oil level, then start it again and then warm it up. So Honda are doing all the warm up. So Shell did fuel, engine oil, gearbox oil, and they really did a great job for us. I mean, we all contributed, but they helped us win the championship, I think. We talked about the temperature control, so there's no thermostatic temperature control, no adjustment on the cooling, it's all preset. So the amount of air that's allowed to go through the radiator has to be decided by the engineer and the ambient temperature of the day. Put that amount of blanking on and hope it doesn't get too hot. A fixed ECU, so once the chip is loaded in, programmed by Honda, that was it, that was set. In fact, so we'd run the car on the track in practice, do 4 or 5 laps, they'd come in, they'd take all their readings and lambda readings, and then they'd take the chip out, and they might have another one ready with another adjustment, put that in, and then they'd adjust the chip they've taken out. So they changed it by a chip in the ECU.
I was under Steve working on the design of the forward part, well, really from the driver forward, monocoque and nosebox and front suspension. And the design that we came up with was, because the driver's feet had to be on the front axle line, or at least behind the front axle line, which meant, in effect, on the front axle line. So the pedal faces had to be there. It determined the driving position from that point backwards. So the monocoque structure, which includes this insert, which we called it a bathtub, but in effect it's a separately moulded piece that drops in, and it includes the seatback bulkhead, the side panels, and the steering bulkhead, all moulded in one piece, very complex moulding. With the driver's feet on the axle line, the natural position for the dampers had been kind of in line with where the driver's feet were now positioned. So that wasn't an option. And we looked at different ideas. We looked at putting the dampers on the top, which we later did on the MP4-6, but for this car, Steve was fairly insistent that keep the mass as low as we could for all the components. We found 2 pockets whereby the spring damper assemblies could go in and sit nicely, operated by a pull rod. The only problem with that then was the fact that traditionally a pull rod pulls on a rocker, and the rocker, if we had one, would be right in the way of the driver's legs and the legality template. I was chatting to Dave North, who said, well, why don't you use tracks instead of a rocker? So the idea was born, and we put tracks in at the bottom. So the damper is now actually travelling on rollers in tracks.
That track prescribes the arc that a rocker would have moved in, but the rocker's no longer there. It just follows that track. So it's kind of a virtual rocker, you might say. And
then the only problem, not the only problem, but a problem, was the fact that a conventional anti-roll bar couldn't fit in either, because there was no space, again, in the volume that you needed for the legality template to pass through the cockpit. We came up with a slightly different solution, which you'll see in detail, but it's in effect the blades of the bar go across the car, and then there's a central torque tube which pivots just in front of the steering bulkhead. And it's shaped a bit like the old-fashioned lawnmower handle, so it became known as the lawnmower handle front anti-roll bar.
But the whole assembly ends up looking a bit of an H.
Yes.
You know,
Yeah.
you've got the mountings across one end. Matthew mentions the blades. These blades were flat in one plane and sort of an elliptical shape in the other, so that as you twisted it, flat position would be soft, and then the vertical position would be hard, and that's the way you got the adjustment in the roll bar.
And then the adjuster for those blades is here. And previous to this instructions going on to the side of the car, the drivers memorized it by knowing that it was hard going in and soft coming out. Quite why they remembered it like that, I'm not sure.
It might be interesting to note about the pull rod and rising rate. Some people might not understand rising rate. This arc that I was prescribing, it would change the so-called wheel rate. You know, that has to do with the mechanical advantage that you have in the suspension. So because of the way this arc worked, as you pulled on the pull rod, the further it would go up this arc, the stiffer the front suspension would become. So that meant as the car pitched, as you braked into a corner and you pulled, therefore, on the pull rod, the suspension would effectively become stiffer. And this helped stabilize the car on entry to the corners, and it helped with the pitch sensitivity of the car. And inevitably, the aero-cylinder pressure will move somewhat as the car pitches, and by having that rising rate effect, it limited how much the car would pitch. So it became quite a strong tuning feature. That's one of the things they changed the most often to balance the car, was lengthening or shortening that. It would do quite a lot of things. If I said to the driver, well, I think I want to lower the car, increase the rising rate, reduce the gap to the bump rubber, they'd say, well, you want to do all that at once, at the same time? You know, it sounds crazy. And I'd say, well, okay, what about if we just shorten the push rod, or the pull rod? And they'd say, yeah, okay, do that. Yeah, there's 3 master cylinders there, one for the clutch and one for the front brakes and one for the rear brakes.
Something else you might want to look at is the steering column, which obviously had to clear the driver's toes when with the brake pedal being right in the middle. And we decided to offset the pinion just so that it gave enough access for the mechanics to get their hands in. Otherwise, it would have been on the centre line, and we didn't want to make a bigger hole than we needed to for the access.
Let's talk about fuel capacity and the 150 litre limit. So the fuel cap is underneath this little cover. So the fuel cell is here. This is the way the fuel is filled. Normally, we'd have a quick release fastening on there. Because this car has been on test, this has got a sealed cap, but we'd have a push-turn aircraft fitting. So my job, well, let's say at the factory first. So how do we control the 150 litres exactly? And we needed every last drop of fuel. So the fuel bag, by design, would hold 154, and then we had to size it down to 150 litres for each race. So at the factory, we would alter the fuel capacity by dropping in plastic balls, and we'd measure at the factory to make sure it didn't exceed 150 litres. My job at the race, one of my jobs on the grid, my last job on the grid, was the car would have 150 litres, or 149.5 as it left the garage, but of course it's using a little bit of fuel to get to the grid. So when it came to the grid and stopped, my job was I had a 5 foot tall tube with a big tank on the top with another 5 litres, and I would have to stand on top of the monocoque and release the cap and put the last drop of fuel in to brim full it with a little bit of pressure. That was how and every race we won, we had to take the fuel cell open, we had to dry all the fuel out, completely dry, and then the FIA would watch as we measured the fuel in. And generally we were always under 150 litres. Okay, let's talk about the cockpit, if I can remember all the controls, a long time ago. So, steering wheel, we've got a radio button and a boost button, an overtake button. That's all on the steering wheel. We have a manual gear lever, So it's got a 6-speed gearbox. Means that they've got to, when they downshift, they've got to blip the throttle. This is not a seamless shift box like they have now. So clutch and manual gear shift. Let's talk on this side. So we've got ignition switch and pumps. So these are in-tank pumps. That pushes the fuel from the bottom of the tank up to the collector pot. Ignition on and off. We've got boost control, which they get a readout on the dash, how much boost pressure. Radio on-off button. These switches here, this here is for the dampers. We had Showa dampers on this car, and quite advanced. Showa were part of Honda, and these dampers, front and rear, were adjustable. This is oil pressure warning light and fuel warning light. Fire extinguisher button. So fire extinguisher, which provides fire extinguisher gas to the driver, and also has a pipe that goes to the engine. This is not the original bottle. The original bottle was made by McLaren's. It's shaped to clear the back of the driver's legs, and we had the bottles filled, but that bottle is not a recognised safety bottle now, and also you can't get them refilled. So this is a proprietary current bottle. Light, so this is the rain light, which is a FIA regulation. All drivers have to put it on when there's a visibility problem. Of course, you've got a removable steering wheel, which has a flexible cable connection. And then you have the front adjustable roll bar. So this operates a blade in there, which Steve was talking about, and you can see the blade.
Give him a wiggle. Yep, I get you.
Right.
I get you.
This one here, brake bias adjuster. So F and R, front and rear. So you've got two master cylinders, one for the front brakes, one for the rear brakes, and you've got a screw adjuster, so you can adjust how much brake you have on the front and how much on the rear. Same as on a modern Formula One car, but they've got a more computer-controlled lever. This is a simple, if you look down there, you can see that's the office. These pads, worth mentioning these, this is to protect the driver's elbows from getting bruised on the tub when he's working the steering wheel. This was a mechanic's trim piece. I remember doing these. That's it. That's the cockpit.
Well, you know, the cockpit on these cars is inevitably a pretty tight squeeze, and Prost had been with us for a while, and we were designing this part of the car around him, and when Senna arrived, it's quite a tight squeeze, and he said, "Oh, I've been working out in Brazil, you know, and upper body strength and all that," and he was really tight on his shoulders, and I said, maybe you could stop now.
Stop with the exercise.
with the exercise, because
it was really,
over the sides. It was a tight squeeze. Yeah, I don't know. The old girl looks pretty good to me all these years later. I suppose I'm prejudiced, but it's just lovely, really. The aesthetics of it. It looks nice with the bodywork on, and you know, seeing all the beautiful work underneath. You know, the efforts of the designers, the efforts of the fabricators, the efforts of the laminators, you know, to make all these components. And, you know, look at all these pieces. It's just mechanical art, you know, and it's fantastic. And speaking to the design process, you know, I was really privileged to be given the opportunity to do this, you know, working at a major Formula One team with a major budget and working with such a talented group of engineers. You know, we'd worked together for a few years, and I don't know, it was beyond team. It was almost more like family, and you know, we liked each other. We worked well together. We respected each other. We discussed things, and we all move forward in the same direction. So it was a fantastic thing to create this, and it was a fantastic thing to see it be built by the other talented people who made it all, who did the laminating and the welding and the fabricating and the machining and the mechanics that screwed it together, and everybody that did such a fantastic job. I remember once in a conversation with Rick Goodhand, one of the mechanics, he said we knew that the design was fantastic and we knew that the drivers were fantastic and that if anything was going to screw it up, it was us, the mechanics, that were going to let the side down. So he said we made absolutely sure that we were doing everything as perfect as we could. And hence you get this reliability and, 15 out of 16 races, 10 1-2s. It's just the ultimate expression of the advantage of teamwork. And that's the main memory I take away from it all, is working with all those people in that fantastic sort of family atmosphere. All the time at McLaren you'd be there, you're on salary so you're not getting paid for, but all these people would be in on a Saturday morning. Not getting paid, but there was just nowhere else they'd rather be.
I just remember it being a really intense period, between August '87 and when the car had to first run. And as that time got nearer and nearer, we were under more and more pressure to obviously do the best job we could, but just to get it made, give everybody enough time to get it made was one thing. The fact that it went to Imola and that phone call back to say, it's within 5 laps, it's 2 seconds quicker than anybody's gone previously. It was just absolutely incredible. Yeah. There's a perfect storm of, Ron putting together that team, JB having taught us what he knew, and we sort of continued with a lot of his philosophies. All the people that really, as you say, Steve, pulled together as a team and were just interested in, contributing to the McLaren family as we were.
It was kind of, I guess, looking back on it now, it was kind of a leap of faith on Ron's part to put us in charge of doing this. At the time, I felt that it was the culmination of all the experience of McLaren over the years coming together in this, the best that we could think of.
For me, I have to say, it's been a fantastic day to see this car in beautiful condition, beautifully restored, a full running car, and to be here as Chris's guest and to do this YouTube presentation. I think it's been a great experience. Yeah, absolutely. We could talk for hours and hours, couldn't we? But for me, I'd left the team in '81 to set up my own F3 team, and I knew Senna when he was coming up through Formula 3. So when I came back to work for Ron in '85 to do the new factory, and then I was on the team in '87 with Prost and Stefan, I was coming back into racing. But when '88 came round and I knew that Ayrton was coming on board with Alain, and Ron asked me to be chief mechanic, I was so thrilled to be able to, I'd worked a year with Alain, with the tag engine, but I was thrilled to be with Ayrton as well. And what a year, 2 years, because the year after was good. So I sat down with Ron when he asked me to be chief mechanic, and he agreed my salary, and I said, and prize money, and he said, well, hang on, he said, we might have a very good year. And I said, well, we might have a bad year. So he said, okay, same as the mechanics, £50 a point. End of '88, I came home with £10,000 prize money, and probably the best year of racing that I've had since 1968. In fact, the year after, we had equally good success, and for me, that was the way of going out back into a job in the factory to finish trackside with this car and the subsequent car. And also, got to mention Honda, what a great job they did. I know the engine had been fully developed, but they were full on.
I think everybody probably says whatever they're doing or whatever stage of their career they're in, they do something special and it's special to them. But we truly were in a golden era of Formula One.
Everything, to win a championship, everything's got to come together in the year. Your drivers, tyres, chassis, engine, everything, reliability as well. Our guys, my guys on my team, can't say my guys, the guys I work with, every detail, every fixing, every nut and bolt and torque check. And they do the same now, but yeah, for me, it was a magic year.
Well, there we go. With a film like that, I'm not sure it strictly needs an outro, but I'm going to do one anyway. A huge thank you to everybody involved today, particularly my 3 on-screen co-stars and Damani and Antony from my second channel, JayEmm and Friends, who once again have been behind the other cameras helping make this stuff possible. And none of it could be doable without you too. So make sure to hit that like button, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already to this channel and JayEmm and Friends, and I hope to see you for the next one. Bye-bye.